The mayor slammed the contract down on the table so hard that the oil lamp rattled and nearly tipped. "You don't get to walk away from this," he said, and his voice was the kind of quiet that was worse than shouting. "I brought 10 women across 3 territories to stand in that line. I spent town money, council money, my reputation." He jabbed his finger at the paper. "You're going to choose one of the 9 I selected, Caleb. The Voss woman doesn't count. She was never on the list." Caleb Whitmore didn't look at the contract. He looked at the mayor the way a man looks at something he's already decided to step around. "I already chose," he said. "If this kind of story moves you, the ones where the wrong person turns out to be exactly right, then subscribe to this channel and follow along to the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it." The morning they brought the women to Harlan's Crossing, the sky was doing that thing it sometimes did in late October, pale gray and flat, like a sheet of tin left out in the cold, the kind of sky that didn't promise anything. Caleb Whitmore stood on the porch of the Harlan's Crossing Town Hall, which was really just a wide-fronted building with a second-hand sign nailed above the door, and he watched the wagon come in from the eastern road. He had a cup of coffee in his hand that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. He hadn't touched it since. He hadn't wanted this. That was the part nobody talked about. The mayor, Gerald Fitch, had arranged the whole thing without what anyone could fairly call Caleb's consent. There had been a meeting in August, a council meeting Caleb had attended because they were discussing water rights along the Southern Creek, which actually mattered to him. And somewhere between the water rights and the end of the evening, Fitch had maneuvered the conversation into territory that Caleb hadn't seen coming until it was too late. "A man in your position," Fitch had said, leaning back in his chair with the particular ease of a man who believed his comfort was the room's natural condition. "A man with land like yours, acreage like yours, standing like yours, that man needs a wife. The territory needs to see that kind of stability." Caleb had said he wasn't interested. Fitch had smiled the way he always smiled when he thought the other person's objection was simply a preliminary to eventual agreement. "I've already sent the letters," he said. "Women are already traveling." That had been 2 months ago, and now here they were. The wagon stopped in front of the hall. Caleb finished none of his coffee and set the cup on the porch railing and went inside, because standing out there watching women climb down from a wagon felt like the worst thing he could do to them, or to himself. Inside, Fitch was already at the front of the room, greeting people, shaking hands with the 2 council members who'd shown up, adjusting his collar in the small mirror someone had hung near the door for reasons Caleb had never understood. The room smelled like sawdust and old wood, and the particular mustiness of a building that got used for town meetings, and not much else. "Caleb," Fitch crossed the room in 6 long strides and clapped him on the shoulder. Good man for being here." "I live 12 minutes away," Caleb said. "It wasn't much of an effort." Fitch laughed as if that were funnier than it was. He had a way of responding to everything Caleb said as if it were a form of cooperation, which it never quite was. "They'll be lining up in the main room. You walk through, take your time, make a selection, simple as buying a horse." Caleb looked at him. "I'd like you to never say that again." Fitch blinked. "I only meant—" "I know what you meant." Caleb moved past him toward the main room. "Let's just get through this." What he was thinking, though he didn't say it, was that he would walk through the room, be respectful to each woman, and then tell Fitch that he couldn't make a choice today, that he needed more time. He'd say it politely, and he'd mean it genuinely, and then he'd go home and figure out some longer-term way to get out of the whole arrangement without embarrassing anyone publicly. That was the plan. The plan lasted about 45 seconds. There were 9 women arranged along the wall of the main room when he walked in, and they were all watching the door the way people watch a door when they've been told someone important is coming through it. 9 women of varying ages and expressions, some clearly nervous, some deliberately composed, 1 or 2 who looked frankly bored, all of them dressed in their considered best. Caleb nodded to the room generally because acknowledging people was something he believed in even when he had no idea what to say to them, and then he did what Fitch had suggested and walked slowly along the line. He wasn't looking for beauty. He wasn't looking for youth. He honestly wasn't sure what he was looking for, which was part of why the plan to walk through and delay had seemed reasonable. You couldn't choose something when you didn't know what you wanted. He'd learned that the hard way. He was near the end of the line, already composing the opening sentence of his polite deferral to Fitch, when he noticed the woman standing slightly apart from the others. Not dramatically apart, not staged apart, just slightly off to the side, as if she'd ended up at the end of the line because she'd arrived last and hadn't seen any reason to push her way into a better position. She was wearing a dress that had been washed so many times the color had gone approximate. It had probably been dark blue once, and now it was somewhere between blue and the memory of blue. Her boots had dried mud on them from the road. Her hair was pinned up, but not elaborately, the way a woman pins her hair when she's doing it herself in a wagon mirror and has other things on her mind. She was looking at the window, not at him. At the window, at the flat gray sky outside. Every other woman in the room was watching him. This one was watching the weather, with the focused expression of someone calculating whether it was going to rain before she needed to get somewhere. Caleb stopped. She didn't notice immediately. When she did notice, when she became aware of the fact that the man everyone was waiting for had stopped walking and was standing in front of her, she turned and looked at him with an expression that was completely, startlingly ordinary. Not eager, not afraid, not strategically pleasant, just looking at him the way you look at a person. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said. "You can keep going," she said. "I'm at the end. There's nobody after me." "I know," he said. She studied him for a moment with the direct, unhurried assessment of someone who didn't have the social habit of pretending not to look. "Are you trying to decide something?" "I think I already decided," he said. "I'm just standing here." She frowned slightly, not hostilely, just thoughtfully. "That's a strange thing to say." "It is," he agreed. He turned and found Fitch hovering at the edge of the room, his expression the complicated mix of relief and confusion that Caleb imagined people's faces looked like when something both happened and didn't happen the way they expected. "Her," Caleb said. "I'd like to speak with her." The room reacted before Fitch did. Caleb heard it. Not loud, not dramatic, but the particular sound of 9 people recalibrating their expectations all at the same time. A small collective exhale. The sound of surprise trying to be polite about itself. Fitch crossed the room in what was probably supposed to look like a calm walk. "Caleb, could I have a word with you first?" "You can have several," Caleb said. "After. It's just that the woman you've indicated, Miss Voss, she wasn't what?" Fitch lowered his voice. "She wasn't among the primary candidates. There was a mix-up with the transport arrangements, and she ended up traveling with the group, but she wasn't formally. Was she traveling to Harlan's Crossing?" "Well, yes, but then she's here," Caleb said, "same as everyone else." Fitch opened his mouth and closed it and opened it again. He looked like a man who had organized an event and was watching it proceed in a direction he hadn't built the program to accommodate. "Caleb, I just think, Gerald." Caleb said the man's first name with the specific flatness that indicated the conversation was over. "I'd like to speak with the woman." He turned back before Fitch could regroup. She, Clara Voss apparently, had watched the exchange with the same direct steadiness she'd shown from the start. Most people watching 2 men have a tense conversation about them from 10 feet away would have pretended not to watch. She didn't bother pretending. "He doesn't want you to pick me," she said when Caleb came back. It wasn't a question. "No." "Why not?" "Apparently you weren't on the original list." She considered this. "I wasn't. I came with the group because I needed the transport. I wasn't planning to." She paused and appeared to make a decision about how honest to be, then proceeded with what seemed to be most of it. "I wasn't planning to go through with any of this. I just needed to get here." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "Why here?" "Because here is further from where I was than anywhere I could afford to get to on my own." It was such an honest answer that it briefly stopped the conversation. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't, but because it was the plainest thing anyone had said to him in this room, and possibly the plainest thing anyone had said to him in longer than he could easily remember. What were you going to do when you got here? He asked. Find work, figure something out. She shrugged with one shoulder, the way people shrug when they've accepted uncertainty as a weather condition. I'm good at figuring things out. What kind of work? Anything practical. I can cook, fix things, manage a household. I'm not afraid of hard work. She said it without pride, just inventory. Facts about herself the same way you'd describe the contents of a bag. Caleb nodded slowly. All right, he said. Here's what I'll tell you straight, because I don't see much point in doing it any other way. I didn't want this arrangement any more than you did. Fitch organized it without my real agreement, and I've spent 2 months trying to figure out how to get out of it without causing a scene. I walked in here planning to smile at everyone and then tell him I couldn't decide today. Clara studied him. What changed? You were looking at the window. She stared at him. That's what changed your mind? I was looking at a window? Everyone else was looking at me, he said. You were looking at the weather, like you had somewhere else to be. I do have somewhere else to be. I just don't know where yet. I know, he said. That's what I mean. She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her turning something over in her mind, examining it from different angles the way a practical person examines something before they decide what to do with it. You're asking me to, I'm not asking anything yet, he said. I'm telling you I'd like to speak with you more. Not here, with Fitch watching and 9 women I feel terrible about behind me. Somewhere quieter, if that's something you're willing to do. She looked at him for a long moment, and whatever she was calculating, she was doing it seriously. For how long? As long as it takes for one of us to decide this is a bad idea. And if we both decide that? Then we've wasted an afternoon, he said, and you're no worse off than you were an hour ago. Clara Voss let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but the shape of one. All right, she said. One conversation. Fitch descended on them both the moment they turned away from the wall, and what followed was not, technically, a scene, but it was the kind of exchange that would be described as a scene by everyone who overheard it, which was most of the room. Caleb, Fitch planted himself in the path between them and the door. I need you to reconsider. I've considered it, Caleb said. I'm done considering. The woman wasn't on the approved list. Your approved list, Caleb said. Not mine. I don't recall approving a list. Fitch's face went through several rapid changes. The town council agreed. Then the town council can marry her, Caleb said. He wasn't angry exactly. He was the particular kind of unmoved that's worse than anger, because anger you can argue with. Gerald, move. Fitch looked past him at Clara, and Caleb didn't like what crossed the man's face in that moment. It was the look of a man not finding what he expected to find and blaming the thing for not being what he wanted it to be. Miss Voss, Fitch said, with the careful tone of a man being diplomatic while intending to be otherwise. I hope you understand that your position here is irregular. Clara met his eyes and didn't shift. I understand several things about my position, she said. I'm comfortable with irregular. Fitch drew himself up. I arranged this process for the benefit of Harlan's Crossing and its most prominent citizen. A certain standard, Gerald, Caleb said, was implied, and I'm simply saying that, Gerald, Fitch stopped. You've been speaking for about 40 seconds longer than I'm going to tolerate, Caleb said. We're leaving now. I'll speak to you tomorrow. He held the door open for Clara, and she walked through it without looking back at the room. Outside, the gray sky was doing exactly what she'd been studying it for, massing low in the northwest, the particular gray that meant rain by mid-afternoon. She was right. She had somewhere to be, and she'd read the weather correctly. He's going to make trouble, she said, when they were far enough from the door. He makes trouble for sport, Caleb said. I've dealt with it before. She glanced at him sideways. He organized this whole thing. Why would he push back on whoever you chose? Caleb was quiet for a step or two. Because he had something in mind when he organized it, he said. He usually does. What did he have in mind? I've been thinking about that for 2 months, Caleb said, and I don't have a clean answer yet. But Fitch doesn't do things purely out of civic generosity. There's always something underneath. Clara was quiet, turning that over. Then, what's the land situation here? He looked at her. What do you mean? You said you own a lot of it. He's the mayor. Is there anything he'd want from you that a marriage alliance could help him get? Caleb stopped walking. She noticed and looked back at him. Did I say something wrong? No, he said. Nobody's asked me that before. Because nobody said it out loud? Because nobody thought of it, or they thought of it and figured it wasn't their business. He studied her with the full attention of a man revising something. The southern water rights, the creek that runs along my lower land. I've been fighting Fitch's proposed diversion for 3 years. Claire's expression shifted into something sharper and more focused. And if you had a wife who happened to be someone Fitch selected, someone he had some kind of relationship with, or some kind of leverage over, then maybe I'd have a harder time keeping my land laws where I want them, Caleb said. They looked at each other on the road outside the town hall, with the northwest sky darkening and the first faint smell of rain in the air, and Caleb felt something settle in him that hadn't settled in a long time. Not comfort, exactly. Something more like recognition. One conversation, he said. One conversation, she said. But they both knew, in the way you know things sometimes before you've earned knowing them, that the conversation was going to take longer than an afternoon. The rain hit just as they reached the shelter of the covered porch outside Mabel Trent's boarding house, where the chairs were old and uneven, and the view was the main street of a town that had never quite decided what it wanted to be. Caleb brought 2 cups of something Mabel called coffee, and which was close enough to count, and they sat down on either side of a small table that had one leg shorter than the others and rocked every time someone touched it. Tell me about the land you came from, he said. Clara wrapped both hands around her cup. Outside, the rain was coming down clean and straight, the kind that means business. Ohio, she said. Farm town. Not much different from this in the ways that matter. Family? Had some. Don't anymore. She said it without heat or sorrow, just fact, the way a person describes the weather from 2 seasons ago. My husband died 4 years back. We had a farm. After he died, the farm went to his brother because that's how the law worked, and I didn't have the fight left in me to argue it. She turned her cup. Should have argued it. What would you have done with it? Run it, she said immediately. Run it properly. We had good soil, and Harold was kind, but he wasn't a natural farmer. I was. She looked at Caleb with a directness that he was already coming to understand was simply how she did everything. You want to know what I'm doing here, the real version. If you want to give it to me. I was working in a dry goods store in Columbus. The owner died and his son took over and decided he didn't need a female clerk. So I was out. I had money saved, not much, and I needed to go somewhere I could actually build something instead of just surviving in place. She tilted her head at him. The notice about the travel said women could apply for funded transport to Harlan's Crossing for a bride selection. I applied. I got the transport. I figured once I was here I could find work, and if the arrangement turned out to be nothing, at least I'd have gotten somewhere. Caleb nodded. He had asked for the honest version, and she had given it to him without apology or embellishment, and he appreciated it in the specific way that someone who rarely gets honesty learns to appreciate it. What do you know about ranching? He asked. Less than I know about farming, she said. More than nothing. Honest. You said you wanted honest. I do, he said. I'm noting it as a quality. She almost smiled. The almost smile was interesting. It happened fast and then retreated, like something she was used to keeping to herself. What about you? She said. What do you want from this? Actually. He thought about it. The rain was loud on the porch roof, the kind of loud that made honesty easier for some reason, because it covered the silence that comes after hard things. Company, he said, finally. Not the way people say company when they mean something lighter. I mean someone to share things with, someone who tells me the truth, someone who doesn't handle me. She looked at him. Handle you? I own a lot of land, he said. People are careful with me. Even people who've known me for years. They gauge what I want to hear before they say anything. I'm tired of it. He looked at his cup. My wife wasn't like that. She would tell me when I was wrong about something without spending 10 minutes deciding if she should. He paused. She's been gone 7 years. Clara was quiet. I'm not looking to replace her, he said. I want to say that clearly because I've heard of men who do that, and it's not fair to anyone. She was who she was. I'm not looking for another version of her. What are you looking for? He looked at her directly. Someone real, he said. That sounds simple, and I know it isn't, but that's the most accurate I can get. Clara held his gaze for a moment and then nodded, once with the gravity of someone who is used to assessing things carefully and has made a preliminary assessment. One conversation, she said. Is that still where we are? She picked up her cup. Ask me again after it stops raining. The rain stopped 2 hours later, and neither of them had stopped talking. The arrangement Caleb offered Clara that evening was simple, and he was careful to say completely reversible. She would stay at the ranch for 3 weeks. She would have her own room, her own time, and no obligations beyond being honest with him if she decided she wanted to leave. He would show her the land, the work, the daily shape of his life, and she could decide what she thought of it. At the end of 3 weeks, she could go anywhere she chose, and he would give her enough money for travel and 2 months of living expenses. No questions asked, no hard feelings carried. Why 3 weeks, she asked. Because 2 is too short to know anything, and 4 starts to feel like a commitment before either of us has decided anything. She considered it the way she considered everything, seriously, without rushing. And you won't tell people I'm already your wife, or your intended, or whatever Fitch is calling it. I'll tell people you're staying at the ranch, Caleb said, which is true. What they make of it is their own business. They'll make plenty of it. They always do, he said. This town hasn't needed actual information to form strong opinions since about 1871. Clara let out that almost laugh again, the one that happened before she could stop it. Then she said, all right, and they shook hands on it like two people closing a practical arrangement, which was what it was, or what they were both telling themselves it was. The ride out to the ranch was quiet in the way that silences are quiet when two people are paying more attention to each other than either wants to admit. The land opened up as they left the town limits, wide and flat in some places, broken by rock formations and dry creek beds in others. The grass bleached pale by October, but still deep enough to show the quality of the soil underneath. Clara watched it with the eye of someone who understood land as a working thing rather than a pretty one. How much is yours? She asked. From that ridge east to the second tree line, Caleb said, and south past the creek. She looked. She was quiet for a moment. That's a lot of land for one man. I built it over 20 years. What did it look like when you started? A house and 40 acres, he said, and the house needed a new roof. She turned to look at him with an expression of reconsidered respect. Not the impressed kind, the more serious kind, the kind that comes from recognizing actual work. You built all of this yourself? Hired hands helped, he said. But yes, mostly. Why? He glanced at her. Why what? Why so much? What were you building toward? Nobody had asked him that either. He thought about it honestly rather than reaching for a comfortable answer. I don't know, he said finally. It started as survival, and then it became habit. And then I looked up one day and it was just what I was, what I'd made myself into. He paused. Maybe I was building something to give to someone, and then there was no one to give it to. Clara looked at the land again and didn't say anything because it didn't need a response. She just let it sit there, which was the right thing to do. The ranch house was not what she'd expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Some imposing structure scaled to match the acreage maybe, or something deliberately impressive in the way that wealthy men sometimes build things to remind you of the fact. It was neither of those. It was a large house, yes, but built with the particular practicality of someone who thought about function before anything else. Solid walls, deep porch, windows placed where they'd catch morning light and cross ventilation in summer. It had been maintained carefully, but not decorated. It was a house that worked. Inside, the same logic held. The kitchen was well equipped and organized. The main room had 2 good chairs and a table and a fireplace that clearly got used. There were books, more than she'd expected, on shelves built into the wall beside the fireplace, organized not by appearance, but by what looked like genuine reading order, some of them with paper slips marking pages. "You read a lot," she said. "Winters are long," he said, "and I'm not much for cards." She ran her finger along the spines. History, agricultural journals, two collections of poetry that surprised her enough that she almost said something about it, a worn copy of something by Thoreau. She pulled that one slightly out and looked at it and pushed it back. "Your wife's?" she asked. He was quiet for a beat. Some mine." She nodded and didn't push it. A good instinct, because there was a door there, and doors like that needed to be opened from the inside. Her room was at the end of the hall, small, clean, with a window that looked east toward the ridge he'd pointed out from the road. There was a quilt on the bed that was old but intact, the kind of quilt that had been made by someone who cared whether it lasted. She put her bag down on the chair in the corner and stood at the window for a moment, looking at the ridge going dark against the last of the afternoon light. She was already thinking about what needed fixing in the garden she'd glimpsed off the kitchen side. She couldn't help it. It was how her mind worked. She walked into a place and immediately began assessing what was wrong and what could be better. Harold used to say it was exhausting to live with. She'd told him it was why the farm ran. She missed Harold in a low-grade, persistent way, the way you miss a good coat that wore out. Not acutely, not dramatically, but you notice the absence when the weather changes. The first morning she woke before light, which was habit, and lay there listening to the ranch sounds, the particular creak of a large house settling, the distant sound of cattle, wind along the eaves. Then she got up. Caleb was already in the kitchen. He had coffee going and was reading something at the table, and he looked up when she came in without the startled expression of someone not expecting company, which told her he was used to early mornings and had probably heard her moving. "Coffee's ready," he said. "I can see that," she said. "Where's the flour?" He blinked. "The what?" "Flour. You have eggs. I saw them yesterday. If you have flour, I can make biscuits." He pointed at the lower cabinet to the left of the stove, and she found the flour and went to work, because standing around waiting for someone to tell her what to do was not something she'd ever been good at. He watched her for a moment and then went back to his reading, which she appreciated. She didn't need to be watched while she worked. The biscuits were good. They were actually good, not polite good, the kind of good that makes you go quiet while you're eating, because the thing you're eating deserves your full attention. Caleb ate 3 of them without comment and then said, "Where did you learn to cook like that?" "My mother," she said, "and necessity. When you're cooking for farmhands, you learn fast that bad food makes bad workers." "You cooked for farmhands?" "After Harold died, I kept the farm going for 8 months before the brother showed up with the legal papers." She said it matter-of-factly over her coffee. "Hired 2 hands, ran the operation, brought in a partial harvest. Not our best, but enough to show the land was worth fighting for." She paused. "Lot of good that did." Caleb looked at her across the table. 8 months, he said. 8 months. Alone. "The hands were there," she said. "I wasn't alone." "You know what I mean." She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "Alone." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him calibrating something, figuring out what he was and wasn't entitled to say. She'd learned to recognize that particular silence in people. Most men filled it with something useless. He said, "I'm sorry the law didn't work the way it should have." "So am I," she said. And then, because she didn't like sitting in things that couldn't be changed, "What needs doing today?" He showed her the place in the way that someone shows something when they're genuinely proud of it, but don't want to perform the pride. The cattle operation, which was his main income. The barn, which was in good shape. The equipment shed, which was not. The garden on the south side of the house, which had gone to seed in a way that made her want to put her hands in it immediately. "When did you last work this?" she asked. Caleb looked at the garden with the expression of a man looking at something he's been meaning to get to. "Margaret used to tend it. My wife." He paused. "After she died, one of the hands' wives helped for a year or 2. Then she and her husband moved on. I've kept it going enough to have vegetables in summer, but I haven't. It's not what it was." Clara crouched down and dug 2 fingers into the soil near the edge bed and pressed and released. Soil's still good, she said. It's fixable. More than fixable. She stood up and brushed her hands on her skirt. I'll start with the dead material and work from there, if you don't mind. He looked at her crouching in his dead garden in her road-worn dress and said, You don't have to do that. That's not why I brought you here. I know, she said. I want to. I can't walk past something that needs work and not work on it. It's a personal failing. She glanced at him sideways. Unless you'd rather I didn't. No, he said, and there was something in his voice that was careful, the way you're careful with something fragile. Do what you want with it. The days settled into a shape that neither of them had designed. Caleb was up early and out with the cattle or the hands by the time she was making breakfast, and she would leave his plate covered on the back of the stove. She worked in the garden through the mornings, pulling dead growth, turning soil, deciding what was salvageable. In the afternoon, she worked through the house, not imposingly, not the way someone does when they're trying to make a point, but practically the way someone does when they see things that can be better and have the skills to make them so. She mended the curtain in the main room that had been hanging wrong for what looked like years. She repaired the loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet that banged every time the wind came through. She reorganized the root cellar into something that made actual sense, and left a list on the table of what needed to be resupplied before winter. Caleb came in one evening and looked at the list and then at her and said, You did all this today? The cellar was a disaster, she said. It was bothering me. He sat down at the table. Clara. You're not here to be a housekeeper. She set down the pot she was holding and looked at him directly. I know that. I'm here because I don't know what else to be yet, and in the meantime, things need doing and I can do them. Is that a problem? He held her gaze. It's not a problem. I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything. I don't feel that way, she said. I feel like I'm useful. That's different. She picked the pot back up. When's the last time you had someone in this house who was actually useful? He thought about it. Honestly? Preferably. 7 years, he said. She nodded once. Then let me be useful without making it complicated. He didn't argue, because she was right, and he was a man who knew when someone was right. What she didn't tell him, what she was careful not to examine too directly herself, was that she was starting to like the ranch in a way that felt dangerous. She liked the mornings. She liked the sound of the place. She liked the way the land looked from the kitchen window when the light came across the ridge and hit the grass sideways. She liked that the bookshelves had poetry in them, and he hadn't mentioned it, as if it were just a thing that was there and didn't need explaining. She found the photograph on the 12th day. She wasn't looking for anything. She was cleaning the shelf above the fireplace, the one that had gotten dusty in the back corners. And she moved the small wooden box that sat at the far end, meaning to dust under it, and the lid shifted and she saw the edge of it. She shouldn't have looked further. She knew that. She put the box back and finished the shelf and went to make lunch, and then came back 2 hours later and stood in front of the fireplace for a long moment and then opened the box. The photograph was small, the kind taken by a traveling photographer, slightly faded at the edges. A woman in a light-colored dress, not young, maybe 30 when it was taken, dark hair, serious eyes, a straight posture that had nothing performative about it. She was looking just slightly off camera, as if something had caught her attention a moment before the shutter, and whoever had taken the photograph had captured her in that unguarded instant. She was not beautiful in the way that word usually gets used. She was striking, which is a different thing and harder to photograph. She looked like a person who took up the full space of herself without apology. Clara put the photograph back and closed the box and didn't move the box from its place. That evening, Caleb came in and washed up, and they ate at the same table they'd been eating at for 12 days, and somewhere in the middle of dinner she said, "Was her name Margaret?" He went still. "I moved the box on the fireplace shelf," she said. "I wasn't prying. The lid shifted." She kept her eyes on her plate, giving him space to decide how to receive it. "I just saw a bit of it." He was quiet long enough that she started to think she'd made an error. Then he said, "Yes, Margaret. She looked like someone who knew her own mind." A pause. "She did," he said. "She knew it better than anyone I've ever met." Another pause. It used to drive me absolutely insane. Clara looked up. He was looking at his food, but there was something on his face that was nearly a smile. The particular kind that grief and time make out of what used to be frustration, which is love viewed from a long distance. She would argue with me about anything, he said, not to fight, just because she thought through everything herself and she didn't see any reason to pretend she'd landed somewhere different than she had. He shook his head slightly. I was wrong about things. She told me. Often. Were you right sometimes? Occasionally, he said. She told me that too. Clara looked at him. She sounds like she was worth missing. She was, he said quietly. She still is. It was the most honest thing he'd said about it, and she understood, because it took that kind of honesty to say that about someone without turning it into a performance of grief. He missed her cleanly, without theater, the way you miss something that was genuinely good. I'm not her, Clara said. Not defensively, just clearly. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to be. I know you're not, she said. I'm just saying it so we both have it said. He nodded. They finished dinner. He washed the dishes, which he'd done every night without being asked, and she dried and stacked, and neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed saying that night. What was happening between them was not falling, exactly. Falling implied a loss of control that neither of them had. It was something slower and more serious. Two careful, damaged people choosing, inch by inch and day by day, to let their guard down far enough to let another person's reality actually land. It was not comfortable. Comfort was not the point. The point was something closer to truth, and truth in Caleb Whitmore's experience was rarely comfortable and almost always worth it. On the 14th day, one of his ranch hands, a younger man named Pete Doyle, who had a good heart and poor judgment about when to keep his mouth shut, came into the kitchen while Clara was making lunch and said, with the cheerful forthrightness of someone who didn't yet understand what he was walking into, "So are you two actually getting married, or is that just what the town's saying?" Clara looked at him with an expression of perfect calm. "What's the town saying?" Pete had the grace to look slightly alarmed, the way you look when you realize the sentence you started is a horse you can't stop. "Just that, Fitch told some people you weren't really on the list, and some folks think you came out here under, He caught something in her expression and changed course. "Under circumstances that I deceived him," Clara said pleasantly. "I didn't say that." "What did you say?" "I said that some folks—" "Pete." Caleb's voice came from the doorway. He'd come in behind the young man without anyone noticing, and he was still wearing his work jacket, and he was not angry. Anger would have been simpler. He was something quieter and considerably more serious. "Go finish the south fence." Pete went. Clara stood at the counter and looked at the cutting board in front of her, and after a moment said, "It started. It started before we got to the porch at Mabel Trent's," Caleb said. "Fitch has been talking." "What's he saying?" "That you're a fraud, that you came here under false pretenses, that I was taken advantage of." He said it without inflection, just reporting. Clara turned around and faced him. She had the look of someone doing a careful internal accounting. "Are you starting to believe any of it?" He met her eyes. "No." "Are you sure?" "Clara." He said her name the way you say something when you need the other person to hear it at full volume. "I'm sure." She held his gaze for a moment, checking it, because she'd learned long ago not to accept reassurance without checking it. Then she nodded. "All right," she said. "Then we deal with it." "Together?" he said. She turned back to the counter. "Hand me that knife," she said. "Lunch won't make itself." The trouble didn't arrive all at once. It built the way bad weather builds, slowly enough that you could almost convince yourself it wasn't coming, and then suddenly you were in the middle of it, and the sky had been wrong for hours. Fitch had been busy. That much became clear over the following days, in the way that a man's work becomes clear, not from what he says directly, but from the shape of what other people start saying around you. Clara noticed it first in town, on the Thursday when Caleb drove her in for supplies. The woman behind the counter at the general store, a Mrs. Holt, who had been perfectly ordinary in her manner on Clara's first visit, was now careful, precise, Polite in the particular way that people are polite when politeness is doing the work of something else. She counted out Claire's change twice, unnecessarily, and didn't meet her eyes when she handed it over. Clara said thank you and picked up the parcel and walked out to the wagon and said nothing to Caleb until they were 2 streets away. "The storewoman," she said. "Ruth Holt," he said. "She knows something she didn't know last week." He was quiet for a moment. "Fitch had dinner at the Holts Tuesday night. Ruth's husband is on the water council." Clara set the parcel on her knees and looked at the road ahead. "What did he tell them?" "Probably a version of what he's been telling everyone," Caleb said. "That you came here under false pretenses. That you were never on the approved list. That I've been influenced." "Influenced?" she repeated. "That's the polite version." She turned to look at him. "What's the impolite version?" He kept his eyes on the road. "That you're after my land." She absorbed this. She didn't react the way some people would have. No sharp intake of breath, no immediate indignation. She just sat with it for a moment, turning it over, looking at the shape of it. "And people are believing that. Some people are deciding whether to believe it," he said, "which is Fitch's goal. He doesn't need everyone convinced. He just needs enough doubt and enough people to make things uncomfortable enough that I reconsider the water rights negotiation to make it stop." Clara understood politics the way people understand things they've watched destroy what they care about, clearly and without sentimentality. Her father-in-law had used town opinion like a tool when he wanted something. It was an old trick, and it worked because most people would rather have peace than principle. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "What I was already doing," Caleb said. "Nothing different." She looked at him. "That's not a plan. That's just stubbornness." "Sometimes stubbornness is the plan," he said. "If I start changing behavior because of what Fitch says, I've given him something. If I do nothing, eventually people either see the truth or they don't, and the ones who don't aren't people I can do anything about anyway." "That's very calm thinking," she said. "I'm not sure it's right, but it's calm." "Are you worried?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "About my reputation in a town I've known for 2 weeks? Not particularly. About what it might cost you? Yes." He glanced at her sideways, the brief kind, the kind men do when they don't want to be caught looking. "I've been taking care of my own costs for a long time." "I know," she said. "That doesn't mean you have to keep doing it alone." He didn't answer that. She didn't push it. Some things needed room to settle. The meeting with Fitch happened 3 days later, and it was not the meeting Clara had expected. She had expected Fitch to come to the ranch. That was the kind of man he seemed, the kind who arrives on your property to assert something about whose territory they believe it actually is. But it was Caleb who came home on the Wednesday afternoon with a set expression and told her that Fitch had called a council meeting for the following morning and that her presence was, in Fitch's words, requested. "Requested," she said. "He used that word specifically," Caleb said. "I think to make it sound optional." "Is it optional?" "It is," Caleb said, "and I told him you'd be there." She looked at him. "You told him without asking me." He held her gaze without flinching. "I did. If you don't want to go, tell me now, and I'll send word." She was quiet for a moment, calibrating whether to be angry about the presumption or simply note it and move on. She noted it. "I'll go," she said. "But next time ask." "Fair," he said. "What does he want from this meeting?" Caleb sat down at the table, which he did when something required his full thinking attention. "He's going to try to make it official. Put on record that the bride selection was irregular. Try to establish that you have no formal status in the arrangement." He turned his coffee cup between his hands. "Which would leave me looking like I've been harboring a stranger on my property rather than what we actually are." "What are we actually?" she asked, genuinely. He looked at her directly. "I don't know yet. But I know it's not nothing, and I know it's not a deception, and that's what I'm going to say." The council meeting was held in the back room of the town hall, the one that smelled like old smoke and decisions that hadn't aged well. There were 5 council members besides Fitch, and they arranged themselves around the long table with the particular solemnity of men who want to seem like they're doing something important and official when the truth is they're doing something small and local and personal. Clara sat beside Caleb, not behind him, which she'd decided on the walk from the wagon without discussing it, and which she saw Fitch clock the moment they came through the door. He didn't like it. Good. Fitch opened with process, which is what people do when they want to seem reasonable before they do something unreasonable. He described the bride selection arrangement in careful, formal terms. He noted the investment of town funds. He referenced the communication sent and the women who had traveled. He was thorough, and he was precise, and he was building something with his words the way a man lays foundation, invisible until it's too late to pull out without taking the whole thing down. The issue before this council, he said finally, setting both hands flat on the table, is whether the arrangement between Mr. Whitmore and Miss Voss constitutes a legitimate fulfillment of the selection process, given that Miss Voss was not among the formally approved candidates. One of the council members, a heavy-set man named Garrett, who ran the feed store and had always struck Caleb as honest, in the way that people who sell things by weight have to be, said, "What does it matter whether she was on a list, Gerald? Caleb chose her." "The process was funded by council resources," Fitch said. "The process has terms." "The process was your idea," Garrett said. "You wrote the terms." Fitch's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "The terms were approved by this council." "Because you told us it was about civic stability," said another member, a younger woman named Arden Cook, whose family ran the schoolhouse. "You didn't mention that Caleb would be bound to choose from a specific list." He was informed. "Were you, Caleb?" Garrett turned to him. Caleb looked at Fitch when he answered. "I was told women were coming for a selection. I was not told I was required to choose from a pre-approved subset of them. Nobody showed me a list." Fitch straightened. The implication was clear. "Implication isn't an agreement," Clara said. The room went quiet with the specific quality of a room that wasn't expecting the quiet person to speak. Fitch turned his attention to her with the particular expression of a man who has planned something carefully and is now finding an unfamiliar piece in the mechanism. "Miss Voss," he said, with the kind of measured courtesy that carries a weapon inside it. "With respect, you're here as a courtesy. This is a matter of town council business." "And I'm the subject of the business," she said. She kept her voice level and her hands still in her lap. "So I have some interest in the accuracy of what's said. No one has said anything inaccurate." "You said I wasn't formally approved," she said. "That's true." "You implied that means I came here under false pretenses." "That's not." She looked at him directly. "I came here because transport was offered to women traveling to Harlan's Crossing for a selection. I was a woman traveling to Harlan's Crossing. I took the offered transport. I arrived. I was present. Mr. Whitmore spoke with me and made a choice. What specifically was false about any of that?" Fitch opened his mouth. "Specifically," she said again. He closed it. Garrett made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Arden Cook was writing something in the margin of her notes. Fitch recovered. He was good at recovering. Clara gave him that. He turned the conversation by about 40 degrees, the way a man turns a ship when the direct route is blocked, and landed it somewhere more dangerous. "The question of intent," he said, "is relevant here. Miss Voss, you've stated to Mr. Whitmore that you never intended to participate in the selection, that you came for the transport only." The room temperature changed. Clara felt it. Caleb felt it. She saw his jaw tighten slightly, which she'd learned was his version of alarm. "I told him that myself," Clara said, "on the first day." "So you admit that you came here under—" "I came here honestly," she said. "I told a man the truth about my situation. That's the opposite of deception." "You accepted transport meant for women who intended to participate in a selection process. The notice didn't specify intent," she said. "It specified eligibility. I was eligible." "Miss Voss, Mr. Fitch." She leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, just enough to close the distance by a few deliberate inches. "What I'd like to understand is this. You arranged this process. You brought these women here. Mr. Whitmore chose one of them. Whether she was on your list or not, she was present because of your process. He chose. That's what the process was for." She paused. "Unless the process was for something else." The silence that followed had a different quality from the earlier ones. This one had the density of a thing that's been in the room the whole time and has finally been named. Fitch said nothing for 4 full seconds. Clara counted. Then he said, "I'm not sure what you're suggesting." I'm not suggesting anything, she said. I'm asking a question. What was the process for? Garrett was no longer trying to conceal that he found this interesting. Two of the other council members were exchanging glances that said they were thinking things they hadn't thought before. Arden Cook had stopped writing. Fitch smiled, which was worse than if he hadn't. The process was for the benefit of Mr. Whitmore and this community, as I've said. Then it worked, Caleb said. He hadn't spoken in several minutes, and the room shifted toward him. I'm benefited. The selection produced a result. I'd like to move forward. Fitch looked at him. Caleb, the town has concerns. What town? Caleb said. I see 6 people in this room and a storage closet full of old ledgers. What specific citizens are bringing what specific concerns? Fitch straightened. I represent the interests of... Name one person, Caleb said. One person who came to you and said they had a concern about Miss Voss and my arrangement. Name them. Fitch was very still. Because what I've heard, Caleb said, is that you've been having dinners at people's homes and suggesting to them that they should have concerns. That's a different thing. Garrett set both hands flat on the table in a way that mirrored Fitch's earlier gesture so precisely that Clara thought he might have done it on purpose. I'd like to make a motion, he said, to close this item as resolved. Mr. Whitmore made a choice. The choice is within the spirit of the process, even if it wasn't within the letter of whatever list Gerald had in his drawer. Motion to move on. Seconded, said Arden Cook without looking up. Fitch said, This council should not psalm 4-2, Garrett said, counting hands. He looked at Fitch pleasantly. Motion carries. Next item. Fitch sat back in his chair with the careful stillness of a man storing something rather than releasing it. Claire had seen that look before. It was the look of a person who had lost a round and was already thinking about the next one. She kept her own face calm, because showing satisfaction in that room was not something she wanted to do, not with Fitch watching. Outside afterward, standing by the wagon in the thin November light, Caleb said, You did well in there. I just asked questions, she said. You asked the right ones. She looked at him. He's not done. No, Caleb agreed. He's not. The water rights, she said. That's what this is actually about. Everything else is leverage. Yes. What exactly does he want from the creek diversion? Caleb leaned against the side of the wagon and looked at the town hall door. The creek runs along my southern boundary. If it gets diverted the way Fitch wants, it runs through a parcel of land that he and 2 other men have been quietly buying up for 2 years. It would make that land valuable for farming or development. Right now it's dry. Who are the other men? Judge Carver and a man named Ellis Pratt who owns the lumber operation north of town. He glanced at her. 3 men with complementary needs. Fitch needs the legal structure. Carver provides it. Pratt provides the building capacity once the land has water. Clara looked at him steadily. How long have you known this? I've suspected it for about a year, he said. I confirmed most of it about 6 months ago when I had a surveyor friend look at the land records quietly. And you didn't take it to the council? I took it to the 2 council members I trusted, he said. Garrett and Cook. They know. They don't have enough to act on without more evidence. What kind of evidence? A document, he said. A letter, a deed transfer record, something that shows the 3 of them coordinating on this before the diversion vote. I know it exists because Fitch mentioned it once, obliquely, the way people mention things when they're confident they're untouchable, but I haven't been able to locate it. Clara stood very still in the way she stood when she was thinking hard. It was one of the things he'd learned about her in 3 weeks. Her stillness meant activity, not absence. Where would he keep something like that? His office, most likely. He's careful, but he's also arrogant, and arrogant men don't always secure the things they think no one is looking for. Who has access to his office? Caleb looked at her. Clara? I'm asking a question. I know what you're building toward, and I want to be careful. She turned to face him fully. I'm not suggesting anything illegal. I'm asking who has legitimate access to the man's office, because if there's a document that belongs in the public record or the council record, and someone who has reason to be in that building happened to see it. His secretary, Caleb said. A woman named Dot Reeves. She's been working for him for 9 years. Does she like him? He thought about it. She's never said anything either way, which might be its own answer. Clara looked at the town hall. A person leaving was holding the door for another person entering, the ordinary small courtesies of a small town that had no idea what was moving underneath it. "Let me talk to Dot Reeves," she said. "You don't know her." "I don't know anyone here," she said. "That hasn't been a problem so far." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression he got when he was deciding between the version of himself that was protective and the version that recognized when someone was competent. The second version won, which she was beginning to understand was not always guaranteed and was worth appreciating when it happened. "She has lunch at the boarding house on Fridays," he said. Clara nodded. "Then I'll be at the boarding house on Friday." They drove home in the late afternoon with the sun dropping fast behind the western ridge. The ranch came into view the way it always did from this road, solid, deliberate, the shape of something built by a person who intended it to last. And Clara looked at it and felt the things she'd been trying not to examine too directly. She felt like she was coming home, not to something already hers, not to something she'd claimed, to something she might, if she was careful and honest and lucky in the right proportions, be allowed to be part of. It was a feeling she hadn't had since she stood in her own farmhouse in Ohio and watched the morning come in through the east window and thought, "This is mine. This is what I built." It wasn't the same. It was its own thing, with its own weight and its own complications, and she wasn't sure yet what it would ask of her or what she was willing to give. But she felt it, and she stopped pretending she didn't. What she didn't see, because she was looking at the house and not at Caleb, was that he was looking at her, looking at the house. And on his face was the expression of a man who has been careful for 7 years, and is beginning to find that carefulness a smaller and smaller compensation for what it costs. He didn't say anything. He had learned, in his considerable time alone, that some things needed to arrive in their own time, and that hurrying them was the most reliable way to break them. He drove the rest of the way home, and she got down from the wagon and went in to start dinner, and he unhitched the horses and rubbed them down in the barn with the unhurried movements of a man who is doing a task. He's done 1,000 times while thinking about something entirely different, and neither of them said what they were thinking. Outside, the wind was picking up from the north, carrying the first real edge of winter in it, and somewhere in town Gerald Fitch was sitting in his office making plans, and the creek was running along Caleb's southern boundary the same as it had for 30 years, cold and clear and belonging, in the way that water always belongs, to no one and everyone, and the highest ground it can find. Dot Reeves was a small woman with large, watchful eyes and the particular composure of someone who had spent years being invisible by choice. She sat at the corner table at Mabel Trent's boarding house every Friday, with a bowl of soup and a bread roll and a book she never quite seemed to read. And when Clara sat down across from her without invitation on the Friday after the council meeting, Dot looked up with an expression that was neither surprised nor unwelcoming, just assessing. "You're the woman from the Whitmore Ranch," Dot said. "Clara Voss," Clara said. "Do you mind if I sit?" "You're already sitting." "I am," Clara agreed. "I'll move if you'd rather." Dot looked at her for a moment and then closed her book. "What do you want?" Clara respected the directness enough to match it. "I want to know if you're all right." Dot stared at her. "That's not what you came here to ask." "It's the first thing I came to ask," Clara said. "The rest comes after." Dot was quiet. She picked up her spoon and set it back down without using it. 9 years is a long time to work for a person, she said finally, in the tone of someone who has been saving that sentence for a while and is releasing it carefully. "It is," Clara said. "A person learns things in 9 years, about the way a man conducts his business, about what gets written down and what gets left out, and why." She looked at Clara with eyes that had done a great deal of deciding and arriving. And a person might spend a certain amount of time wondering if what she knows is something that should stay known or become known to others. "That sounds like a heavy thing to carry," Clara said. "It is a heavy thing to carry," Dot said flatly. "I'm tired of carrying it." Clara let the silence do its work. Outside the boarding house window, the main street was going through its midday business. A wagon, 2 men talking outside the hardware store, a woman beating a rug on her porch steps with the focused violence of someone taking out frustrations on an inanimate object. "There's a document," Clara said. It was not a question. Dot looked at her soup. "There are several." Clara waited. "A correspondence," Dot said, "between Mr. Fitch and Judge Carver. dated 14 months ago, in which the terms of the land acquisition are described with some specificity. Which parcels? What price? What conditions would need to be created for the value to increase? She picked up her spoon again, and this time used it slowly. Mr. Fitch asked me to file it in the land correspondence folder, which I did, because that was my job. She paused. I made a copy first, because I had a feeling. Clara held very still. Where is the copy? Safe, Dot said. Somewhere that isn't his office. Would you be willing to bring it to the council? Dot set her spoon down. That's the question, isn't it? She looked at Clara with a complicated expression. Not reluctance, exactly, but the specific look of someone who has thought through consequences and found them extensive. If I bring it forward, he'll know it came from me. I'll lose the position. I have a sister in Laramie. I could go there. She touched the cover of her book, which had the quality of a nervous habit she'd had so long she didn't know she was doing it. But I've been in this town for 22 years. I know, Clara said. That's not a small thing to give up. No, Dot said. It isn't. She looked at Clara directly. Why should I trust you? You've been here less than a month and you have your own stake in this. I do have a stake in it, Clara said. I'm not going to pretend I don't. But what Fitch is doing with that land isn't only about me or Caleb. It's water rights for the whole Southern Valley. Farmers who've had access to that creek for decades lose it if the diversion goes through. Dot looked at the window. The Hendersons, she said. The Pryor family. Old Jonas Webb, who's been on that land since before the territory was a territory. Yes, Clara said. Dot was quiet for almost a full minute. Clara waited, because this was the kind of thing you couldn't push. It either landed where it was going to land, or it didn't. Give me a week, Dot said finally. All right. And if I decide to do this, I hand it to Garrett directly. Not through you, not through Caleb, directly to him. That's your decision entirely, Clara said. I'd only want to know whether it's happening so we can be ready. Dot nodded once. She picked up her book and opened it to somewhere in the middle, which meant the conversation was over. Clara stood up. Miss Voss, Dot said without looking up. Clara paused. The women who were on his list, Dot said, I helped send the letters. I typed them. She turned a page she probably hadn't read. He had reasons for each of them, specific reasons. None of them were about Mr. Whitmore's happiness. Clara walked back to where she'd tied the horse and stood there for a moment in the cold air, absorbing that. Then she rode back to the ranch. She told Caleb that evening, concisely and accurately, leaving nothing out and adding nothing she wasn't sure of. He listened the way he listened to everything important, completely still, not interrupting, his hands around his coffee cup and his eyes on her face. When she finished, he said, Dot Reeves. 9 years of watching and making copies, Clara said. She's ready. She just needed someone to make it feel less like standing alone. He was quiet for a moment, then, You're good at this. She looked at him. At what? Seeing what people need to hear, he said. Not what they want, what they need. She shook her head slightly. I just talked to her like a person. That's rarer than it sounds, he said. She didn't answer that, partly because she wasn't sure how to take it, and partly because he was looking at her in a way that required her to find somewhere else to look. She found the fireplace and looked at that instead. Caleb, she said. Yes. My 3 weeks ended 4 days ago. The fire did what fires do, which is burn without caring about the weight of what's said around them. He didn't move. I know, he said. You didn't say anything. No, he said. I didn't. She looked at the fire for another moment and then looked at him. Why not? He set down his cup and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees in the posture of a man who is done doing things at a distance. Because I didn't want to make it a question if the answer was going to be no. I'd rather have more time with an uncertain outcome than no time with a certain one. She sat with that. That's an honest answer? You trained me, he said. She almost laughed. Not quite. I haven't decided anything, she said. I want to be clear about that. I know. And I don't want you thinking that just because I'm still here, Clara, he said it with the kind of patience that has worked itself past its own frustration. I know. You're still thinking. I'm still waiting. Neither of those things is a problem. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had patience like other men had land. A lot of it, accumulated slowly and maintained with effort. Most men would have asked by now, she said. Most men would have, he agreed. I'm tired of doing what most men do. The week that followed was the hardest one. Not because anything went dramatically wrong, it didn't, but because the waiting had a quality that neither of them could fully ignore. Fitch appeared in town wearing the expression of a man who was confident in his position, which meant either he didn't know about Dot or he didn't think Dot would move. Clara hoped it was the latter. On the Wednesday, Fitch's next move arrived in a form Clara hadn't anticipated. She was in the garden, mid-November now, too cold for serious work, but she'd been turning the last of the soil under for winter, when she heard the wagon coming up the ranch road. She stayed where she was, because it was Caleb's ranch and Caleb's road, and she didn't have a reason to be the one meeting visitors. But then she heard Caleb's voice from the porch, and another voice, and something in the second voice made her stand up and turn around. The man getting down from the wagon was well-dressed in the way that men are well-dressed when they want you to know they're well-dressed. An expensive coat, new boots, a hat with the kind of careful brim that wasn't frontier practical and wasn't meant to be. He was about 50, heavy through the chest, with the kind of broad, easy confidence of someone who'd never had much reason to doubt themselves. Caleb's posture told her everything. He'd gone very still, the kind of still that wasn't calm. It was the kind that was holding something back. She pulled off her garden gloves and walked toward the porch. Clara, Caleb said when she reached the steps. His voice was steady, but his jaw had the tightness she'd learned to read. This is Ellis Pratt, the lumberman, the third name in the arrangement. She looked at him with an expression that gave nothing. Pratt looked at her with the particular appraisal of a man who has catalogued women in categories all his life and is figuring out which one she belongs to. Miss Voss, he said, with a pleasantness that had no warmth in it. I've heard a great deal about you. From whom? She said. He smiled. Gerald speaks highly of your tenacity. That's generous of him, she said. What can we do for you, Mr. Pratt? He turned back to Caleb with the deliberate ease of a man who's decided the woman doesn't need to be part of a conversation that affects her. Clara noted it and said nothing. I wanted to come out personally, Pratt said, man to man. I think there's been some confusion about the Water Council's intentions that could be resolved if we simply sat down. We've sat down before, Caleb said, 3 times. Under different circumstances, Pratt said. I think you'd find our current proposal considerably more accommodating to your needs. In what way? Pratt looked briefly at Clara in a way that was meant to suggest she should give them privacy. She stayed exactly where she was because she was standing on the porch of a house she'd been living in for a month, and she wasn't moving because a lumberman's eyes suggested she should. Pratt returned to Caleb. Financial compensation for any water access disruption, a guaranteed secondary channel to maintain your southern pasture irrigation, and an ongoing relationship with the Pratt lumber operation that could prove quite valuable to a ranching concern of your size. Clara watched Caleb's face. He was listening, which was different from agreeing. He listened to everything, which was one of his better qualities and occasionally a maddening one. Why now? Caleb said. Pratt raised an eyebrow. Pardon? 3 previous conversations, Caleb said. No financial compensation was mentioned, no secondary channel. Why has the proposal changed now? Pratt paused with the pause of someone who has an answer prepared but is deciding whether the prepared answer is the right one. We want to move forward, he said. The diversion vote is in 6 weeks. We'd like it to be uncontested. Why would it be contested? Because you have relationships with Garrett and Cook, Pratt said, and for a moment the pleasantness dropped just slightly, the way a stage flat drops when someone bumps it from behind. And if you were to present objections backed by your standing in this territory, the vote could become complicated. There it was. Clara watched Caleb and saw the moment he saw it too. The proposal wasn't an accommodation, it was a purchase. They wanted to buy his silence with money and a lumber contract before something they were worried about became public. They knew about Dot. or suspected, or were simply nervous enough about the document's existence to preempt it. "I'll think about it," Caleb said. Pratt's pleasantness returned fully, which meant he thought think about it meant yes. "Of course. Take your time. Gerald will be in touch." He touched his hat brim toward Clara in a gesture that managed to be both courteous and dismissive at the same time, and climbed back into his wagon. When the wagon was down the road and out of sight, Caleb said, "They know something's moving. Or they're afraid something is," Clara said. "Which is almost as good." "Dot needs to move faster," he said. "She said a week," Clara said. "It's been 5 days." "I know." He looked at the road where the wagon had gone. "Pratt doesn't make personal visits, he sends people. The fact that he came himself means Fitch pushed him too." "Because Fitch is worried," she said. "Because Fitch is worried," he agreed. She thought about it. "If we refuse the proposal, they'll know we're waiting on something. If we accept it, we've handed them the creek and everything downstream of it," Caleb said. "And Garrett and Cook lose the one ally they have in this." "Then we don't accept," she said. "You tell him you're still considering, and we give Dot until Friday." He looked at her with the full attention he gave things when they mattered to him. "We," he said. She looked back at him steadily. "We," she said. "Don't make it strange." He didn't make it strange. He sent word to Pratt that he was still considering, and they waited. Dot came on Thursday, not Friday. Thursday, in the late afternoon, with a leather folder under her arm and the expression of a woman who has made a decision and is moving before she can unmake it. Clara met her at the door and took her inside and called Caleb in from the barn. The three of them sat at the kitchen table and Dot opened the folder. The correspondence was 12 pages. Caleb read it without speaking and passed each page to Clara, who read it the same way. The language was careful. It was written by men who knew what they were doing, but the meaning was unmistakable. The agreement between Fitch, Carver, and Pratt predated the diversion proposal by 8 months. The land parcels were named. The financial arrangements were laid out. One paragraph discussed how the water rights proposal would need to be framed to the council to minimize opposition, with specific reference to Caleb Whitmore as the primary obstacle and a notation that Whitmore's personal situation, and here Dot had circled it in pencil, some time ago, alone in her office, could be leveraged if necessary. Clara looked at that circled paragraph for a moment. Then she looked at Dot. "He was planning to use whoever Caleb married," she said. "Yes," Dot said. "Whoever was on that list had a prior arrangement with Fitch. I don't know all the details, but 2 of the women had family connections to Pratt's lumber operation. One was the niece of a man who owed Fitch a significant debt." She folded her hands on the table. "I don't know if any of them knew what they were part of. They may not have." Caleb set the last page down. He was very quiet in the way that comes after anger has passed through and left something colder behind. "And if I'd chosen one of them." "Then you'd have had a wife with people around her who were managed by Fitch," Dot said. "And pressure on you would have had a second channel." He looked at Clara. She looked back at him. There was something in that exchange that didn't need words. The recognition that her being at the wrong end of the line, watching the weather instead of the door, had been the smallest and most consequential accident of the whole season. "What do you need from me?" Dot asked. "To go to Garrett." Caleb pulled his eyes from Clara. "Nothing more than what you've brought. Can you go tomorrow morning?" "I can go tonight," Dot said. "Garrett's home evenings, and I'd rather do this before I lose my nerve." "Do you want one of us to come with you?" Clara asked. Dot looked at her. "No," she said, with a dignity that was very quiet and very complete. "I've been carrying this by myself for 14 months. I'll put it down by myself." She picked up the folder and left. They heard her wagon on the road for a minute, and then it faded. Caleb sat at the table with his hands flat on the surface, looking at the place where the pages had been. "She's going to lose her job," he said. "I know," Clara said. "I'll help her. Whatever she needs. Position, money, a reference to anyone who asks." "She knows that," Claire said. "She didn't do this for the help. She did it because it was the right time and someone asked her the right way." He looked up at her. She was still standing by the window where she'd gone when Dot left, the last of the afternoon light coming in sideways the way it did at this hour, and she had one hand resting on the windowsill and the other tucked against her side, and she was looking at him with an expression that was unguarded in a way she probably didn't know. He stood up. She watched him cross the kitchen, which didn't take long, and she didn't move from the window. "Clara," he said. "Don't say anything complicated," she said. "I wasn't going to," he said. "Good," she said, "because I'm still not sure about things." "I know," he said. "Neither am I." "But I'm less unsure than I was," she said, "for what that's worth." "It's worth a considerable amount," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had rebuilt himself on 40 acres, and patience, and the particular stubbornness of someone who doesn't know how to stop. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I noticed," he said. "I fix things that aren't mine to fix, and I say what I think even when it's not what people want to hear, and I get up before it's light, and I don't know when to stop working." "Yes," he said. "I've observed all of that." "And you're still—" "Yes," he said. "I'm still." She let out a breath. Not a dramatic breath, just the ordinary kind. The kind that carries something with it when it leaves. "All right," she said quietly. "All right." He didn't reach for her hand. He just stood close enough that the distance between them was no longer the kind of distance that meant anything, and she didn't step back. And outside the wind was coming in from the north again, and the ridge was going dark against the sky. And in town, Dot Reeves was climbing down from her wagon in front of Garrett's house with a leather folder under her arm, and 14 months of certainty finally finding somewhere to land. Garrett called the emergency council session for the following Monday morning, which gave the documents 3 days to be read, verified, and understood by the people who needed to understand them. He did it quietly. No public announcement, no notice posted outside the town hall, just 4 personal visits on Thursday evening after Dot left his house to the specific council members whose judgment he trusted and whose votes he needed. Fitch found out about the meeting on Sunday. Clara didn't know how. People in small towns always find out, through channels so ordinary they're invisible. A wife who mentioned it to a neighbor, a council member whose expression gave something away at church. However it happened, by Sunday afternoon word had reached the ranch that Fitch had spent most of the day making visits of his own. Pete Doyle, who had better instincts than he usually got credit for, rode out from town around 4 o'clock and tied his horse at the fence and came to the porch with his hat in his hands. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "Fitch was at the Holts and the Bradys and old Silas Marsh's place today. Talked to each of them for about an hour." Caleb was leaning against the porch post with his arms crossed. "What was he saying?" Pete looked uncomfortable in the specific way of someone delivering news they've already decided is bad. That Miss Voss has been going through his private papers, that she's involved in a scheme to discredit him before the water vote, that the whole thing with the bride selection was a setup to plant someone in the territory who would work against him. He turned his hat around once in his hands. "Some people are listening." "Some people always listen," Caleb said. "Thank you, Pete." Pete nodded and went. Caleb came inside. Clara was at the table with a cup of tea she hadn't been drinking because she'd heard the conversation through the open window and had been sitting with it. "He's going to try to frame it as conspiracy before Garrett can frame it as corruption," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. "Can he make that stick?" Caleb pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "With some people. The ones who already wanted to distrust you, he'll give them something to hold on to, but the document speaks for itself. It's in Fitch's own hand, co-signed by Carver. Garrett's had a lawyer look at it, a man from Cheyenne he trusts. The legal exposure is significant." "For Fitch or for Carver?" "Both," Caleb said. "Pratt's technically cleaner on paper, which is probably intentional. He's the kind of man who structures things so there's always someone else holding the visible end." Clara turned her cup. "What happens to him? Pratt? He loses the benefit of the diversion. His land stays dry. That's a financial loss, but not a legal one unless Garrett can find something more direct." He paused. "It may have to be enough." She looked at him. "Is it enough for you?" He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything that mattered. "No," he said, "but I've lived long enough to know that what you get and what's sufficient are rarely the same thing, and you pick which one to keep losing sleep over." She nodded. It was a real answer. She appreciated that he gave those. "Tomorrow's going to be loud," she said. "Probably," he said. "Are you ready for loud?" He looked at her across the table with a steadiness that she'd stopped trying to fully account for, because it was simply how he was. Not performed, not constructed, just present in the particular way of someone who had found out what they were made of and had made their peace with the answer. "Are you?" he said. She picked up her tea finally and drank some of it. "I've been ready for loud since Ohio," she said. He almost smiled. The almost smile which she'd come to recognize as his version of the same thing she did. The expression that got out before the person fully decided to let it. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's early." She went to bed and did not, in fact, sleep particularly well. She lay in the room at the end of the hall with its east-facing window and listened to the wind and thought about Ohio and Harold and her father-in-law's face when he'd handed her the legal papers, the particular expression of a man who expected resistance and was prepared to enjoy refusing it. She'd signed. She'd been too tired and too alone to do anything else. She wasn't tired now. And she wasn't alone. That thought arrived quietly, without fanfare, and she let it sit there in the dark and occupy its space. She wasn't alone. It was such a simple thing, and it cost so much to get to it. The council meeting on Monday was supposed to be closed. Garrett had intended it that way. A contained proceeding, the documents presented, the council deliberating in the manner of people with actual information rather than competing rumors. What it became was something else, because Fitch arrived 40 minutes early with Judge Carver at his side and two men from Carver's legal office, and by the time Garrett and the other council members were in their seats, the room had already taken on the particular atmosphere of something that was going to exceed its intended size. Clara and Caleb arrived together, which was not a statement they'd discussed making, but which became one the moment they walked through the door. She felt the room's attention the way you feel weather, not dramatically, just as a physical fact. She didn't look around. She found a seat along the wall and sat down and looked at the front of the room. Fitch saw her. His expression did something complicated and then resolved into the smooth public face he used for proceedings. Caleb sat beside her, close enough that their arms touched, which was probably more contact than they'd had in weeks of sharing a house, and was, she noted it and filed it, entirely comfortable. Garrett called the session to order with less ceremony than usual, which Clara read as a deliberate signal that this was serious business and not a performance. He stated the purpose plainly. New documentary evidence had come to his attention regarding the proposed water diversion that warranted full council review before any vote proceeded. Fitch was on his feet before Garrett finished the sentence. "I'd like to raise a point of order," he said, with the voice of a man who has spent decades turning procedural language into a weapon. "The so-called evidence you're referring to was obtained improperly. My private correspondence was accessed without authorization." "By whom?" Garrett said. Fitch stopped. "By whom was it accessed improperly?" Garrett said again, with the calm of a man who has prepared for exactly this moment. "Name the person." Fitch looked at Dot Reeves, who was sitting in the second row with her hands folded and her face arranged in an expression of perfect administrative composure. Then he looked at Clara. Then he looked at Caleb. He was calculating which accusation would land best and which would expose him most, and the calculation was taking longer than he wanted it to. The origin of the documents is less important than— "The origin is exactly important," Garrett said, "because if the documents were obtained wrongly, we can't use them, and if they weren't, we can. Which is it?" Carver leaned forward from beside Fitch. He was a judge in the way that some men are judges. Not through temperament or wisdom, but through the accumulated advantages of knowing the right people and outlasting everyone who might have objected. These documents represent private communications between private citizens and cannot be introduced as evidence in any formal proceeding without— "This isn't a court proceeding," Arden Cook said from the council table. She had a pen in her hand and the expression of a woman who taught children for a living and had therefore spent her adult life developing a particular patience for people who tried to make simple things complicated. "It's a council session, different rules." Carver looked at her with the expression of a man who doesn't enjoy being interrupted by women and doesn't expect to have to hide that fact. "The legality of the document's acquisition. Miss Reeves," Garrett said, looking at Dot, "you brought these documents to me. Can you explain how they came to be in your possession? Dot stood up. She was small enough standing that she didn't look dramatically different than sitting, but she held herself with a steadiness that made the room feel like it should pay attention. I am Mr. Fitch's administrative secretary, she said, in the precise tone of someone who has decided on every word in advance. My duties include maintaining all correspondence files. These documents were part of a correspondence file I was asked to maintain. I am a town employee as well as an employee of the mayor's office. When I became aware that official correspondence contained information relevant to a matter of public concern, I brought it to the appropriate council authority. She looked at Fitch with the composed directness of someone who has nothing left to protect. I made a copy of my own work files. There was nothing improper about that. Fitch's face had gone the color of old plaster. You were in a position of trust. I was, Dot said, and I used it to protect the public interest, which I believe is what positions of trust are for. She sat back down. The room was very quiet for about 4 seconds. Then it was not quiet at all. What followed was an hour and 40 minutes of procedural argument that Clara mostly tracked by watching Garrett's face, because Garrett was the one doing the work, and his expression told her more about the state of things than the actual words being said. When he looked satisfied, things were going the right way. When he looked like he was managing something, they weren't. For most of the first hour, he was managing. By the end of it, he was satisfied. The vote to suspend the water diversion proposal, pending a full legal review, passed 4-2. Fitch and one other council member, a man named Bose, who had been Fitch's ally for years in the particular way that people are allies when they've accepted being on the weaker side of a long relationship, voted against. The 4 who voted for included Garrett, Cook, and 2 members who had arrived uncertain and left with their minds made up by the documents rather than by Fitch's arguments. Fitch stood at the end and said that this wasn't finished. He said it with the particular conviction of a man who means it. Clara believed him. Unfinished was different from one, and she'd been careful not to confuse the two. Outside afterward, in the cold noon air, Garrett shook Caleb's hand and then turned to Clara with a different expression, the look of a man reassessing something he'd filed under a wrong category. You've been here a month, he said. 5 weeks, she said, and you found Dot Reeves in a week. I had lunch, she said. She did the finding. He looked at her for a moment, and whatever he saw seemed to settle something. You're good for this place, he said. Harlan's Crossing, I mean. Whether you know it yet or not. She didn't say anything to that because she didn't know yet how much of it was true, and she wasn't in the habit of accepting assessments before she'd verified them. But she noted it. Fitch's formal removal from the mayor's office didn't happen quickly. These things never do. But the legal review Garrett had initiated moved with the particular efficiency of a process that has good documentation and a lawyer from Cheyenne who takes a serious interest in land fraud. By December, Carver had quietly resigned from the bench rather than face a formal inquiry. By January, the diversion proposal had been officially withdrawn. Pratt closed his Harlan's Crossing operation in February and moved it north, which everyone understood was the action of a man putting distance between himself and a paper trail. Fitch stayed. That was the part Clara hadn't fully anticipated, that a man who had been exposed this thoroughly would simply remain in place, attending functions, greeting people on the street, wearing the face of someone who had survived something unfair. He lost the election in the spring, but he didn't leave. She asked Caleb about it one evening, the particular February evening when Pratt's wagon convoy had passed through town heading north, and half the people who doubted her had found occasion to be polite to her on the street that week. Why does he stay? She said. Caleb was sharpening a knife at the kitchen table, the long, unhurried strokes of someone doing a task by feel. Because leaving would mean admitting something, he said. Fitch believes his own version of himself. He genuinely thinks he was doing what was best for the territory, and that the obstacle was the people who stopped him, not the thing he was trying to do. That's a very forgiving interpretation, she said. It's not forgiveness, he said. It's just what I think is true. He looked up. Do you want him gone? She thought about it honestly. I want what he almost did to not be something other people can try again as easily, she said, Whether he's here or not matters less than whether the council has what it needs to stop the next one. He set the knife down. Garrett's already working on the water rights documentation, making it harder to modify without full public disclosure. Good, she said. Clara. I want to ask you something. She looked at him. He had the expression he got when he'd been thinking about something for a long time and had decided to stop circling it. All right, she said. Not because the 3 weeks ended, he said. Not because of Fitch or the water rights or anything that happened this month. I want to be clear about what I'm asking and what it isn't connected to. I understand, she said. He held her gaze with the directness that was simply his way of being in the world. Will you stay, he said, permanently, as my wife? Not because you have nowhere else to go. You have options now, and we both know it, because you want to. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire was going behind her. The knife was on the table. Outside the window, the February dark was complete and cold, and the ranch was making its particular night sounds, and she knew every one of them now, the way you know the sounds of a place that has become yours. Yes, she said. He didn't say anything immediately. She watched something move through his expression. Not surprise, because she didn't think he was entirely surprised, but something more complicated. Relief, maybe. The specific relief of a man who has been careful for a very long time and has finally put something down. Are you sure? He said. You asked me to answer, not to qualify the answer, she said. Yes. He picked the knife back up and went back to sharpening it. She turned back to whatever she'd been doing at the counter. They stayed in the kitchen for another hour, doing ordinary things, and neither of them made more of the moment than it was, which was exactly how it should be. The wedding was in March, when the ground was still cold, but the light had started to come back in the particular way it comes back in that part of the country. Not warm yet, but longer, the days stretching out at both ends like something waking up. They did it in front of the ranch, outside, because Clara had said she didn't want a building around her when she made a permanent promise, and Caleb had said that seemed reasonable. It was not a large wedding. Garrett was there, and Arden Cook, and Pete Doyle, who stood through the whole thing looking like he was trying not to cry and failing moderately. Dot Reeves came, which Clara was particularly glad of. She'd found a position at the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne and was leaving the following week, and she stood at the edge of the small gathering in a good coat she'd bought for the occasion and looked like a woman who had made a decision she was at peace with. Clara wore the dress, the one she'd carried from Ohio in the bottom of her bag, the one she'd packed without knowing why. Not because she'd expected to wear it, but because it had been her best, and you took your best things when you didn't know where you were going. It was a deep wine color that had held over the years, simply made, without the kinds of ornamentation that went out of fashion. She'd pressed it the night before and hung it on the back of the door and looked at it for a while before she went to sleep. Caleb wore his good jacket and a shirt Clara had noticed he owned, but had never seen him wear, and he looked like himself, which was what she wanted. The officiant was a civil justice from 2 towns over, a quiet man named Hollis, who did these things with a straightforwardness that suited both of them. There were no elaborate rituals, no long address. He asked them the essential questions, and they answered them. And when he said it was done, Caleb looked at Clara, and she looked at him, and Pete Doyle made a sound that was definitely crying. Stop it, Clara told him, not unkindly. I'm not doing anything, Pete said, which was not true. Garrett shook Caleb's hand and kissed Clara's cheek with the self-consciousness of a man who doesn't often do that and wanted to do something. Dot hugged Clara once, briefly and firmly, the way women hug when they respect each other and don't need to perform it. Come visit if you're ever in Cheyenne, Dot said. We will, Clara said. Bring him, Dot said, nodding at Caleb. He looks like he could use a city occasionally. Caleb, overhearing this, said, I've been to cities. When? Clara asked. He thought about it. 1879. That was 14 years ago. Cities don't change that much, he said, and Dot laughed, which Clara had not heard her do before, and which turned out to be a very good sound. The rest of that day was ordinary. That was the thing Clara would remember most clearly, years later, when she thought about the day they got married. how ordinary the afternoon was afterward. They ate the food that Pete and Arden had put together. They talked. Garrett told a long story about a water rights dispute from 15 years prior that was probably meant as instructive and mostly just made Caleb look tired. Dot left for town around 4. Pete stayed until he was nudged out by the growing dark. Arden Cook helped clear the table without being asked, and then shook both their hands at the door with the efficiency of a woman whose time is her own and who decides when ceremonies end. And then it was just the two of them in the house, and the fire, and the particular quiet of a day that has been large and has finally become small again. Clara stood at the kitchen window doing nothing in particular. Caleb was at the table. The house held them both the way it had for months now, without effort, without adjustment, just held them. "Are you all right?" Caleb said. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said. He paused. Different. Different how? He thought about it. "Like something I'd been bracing against isn't there anymore," he said, "and I'm still slightly braced, out of habit, but there's nothing to push against." She understood that. She understood it specifically, in the way you understand something that has also been true of you and that you haven't had the words for. "That goes away," she said. "The bracing, slowly." "How do you know?" "Because I've been here for 5 months," she said, "and I noticed that I stopped checking whether I was allowed to be comfortable." She looked out the window at the dark. "I don't know exactly when it happened, but it did." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad you came to that line," he said, "even though you weren't planning to." "I wasn't planning on most of this," she said. "No. I was planning on finding work in a town I didn't know, and being cold through winter and figuring out the next thing after that," she said. "Which I would have done. I'm good at that kind of figuring." "I know," he said. "But this is better," she said. She said it simply, without the careful qualifications she used to wrap around things she wasn't sure she was allowed to mean. Just, "This is better." Not because it's easier. It isn't easier. But because it's more. He looked at her across the kitchen with the expression she'd stopped being unnerved by, the full, undivided look of a man who doesn't do things halfway. "More," he said. "More," she said. There is something that people who have been alone for a long time know, which is this: the hardest part of letting someone in is not the trust. Trust can be built, carefully, the way you build anything that needs to last. Slowly, with attention, with the willingness to repair what breaks without throwing the whole thing away. The hardest part is the permission. Deciding that you're allowed to want something again. That wanting doesn't make you foolish or vulnerable or someone who hasn't learned from what came before. That what came before was real and it mattered and it ended and you are still here. And being still here is not a failure to have stayed with what you lost. It's just the plain fact of being alive, which keeps requiring you to live it. Clara had been giving herself that permission in increments since Ohio. Maybe before Ohio. She'd been a woman who knew what she could do and had spent too many years in situations that didn't let her do it. And somewhere in that long, practical management of reduced expectations, she'd also reduced what she let herself want. You do that. Most people do, when the alternative is wanting something and not getting it repeatedly. You shrink the list. You tell yourself the smaller life is the sensible one, the realistic one, the one appropriate for a woman in your circumstances. Standing in a kitchen in Harlan's Crossing with a man who had chosen her when she wasn't trying to be chosen, she understood that the smaller life had never been sensible. It had been fear wearing the costume of practicality. Caleb's version was different but recognizable. 7 years of building things and having no one to build them toward. 7 years of Margaret's absence becoming a shape that he'd arranged his life around rather than through. He'd been waiting, he thought, until something deserved enough attention to require him to move. What he'd actually been doing was standing still and calling it contentment. Neither of them said any of this. They didn't need to, because they'd been living it in the same house for months, and it was in the rooms already. The spring came in fully by April, and with it the creek, Caleb's Creek, the one along the southern boundary, running high and cold from the snowmelt, which it did every year, filling the culverts and greening the lower pasture in a way that made the cattle do what cattle do when something becomes abundant. Clara stood at the fence by the lower pasture one morning in early April and watched the water run and thought about all the people further down the valley whose land stayed watered because the diversion hadn't happened, and felt a specific satisfaction that was different from the personal kind. Old Jonas Webb stopped by the ranch in April, something he apparently hadn't done in years, and sat on the porch with Caleb and drank coffee and said very little for about 40 minutes, and then said, "Heard what happened with Fitch and the Creek papers. Heard you had help." "I did," Caleb said. Jonas looked at the door where Clara had been visible through the window a moment before. "Good help?" "The best I've ever had," Caleb said. Jonas nodded once with the economy of a man who doesn't see the point of more words when fewer will do. "Good," he said, and finished his coffee and left. Clara, who had heard this from inside, came out to the porch after Jonas's wagon was gone. "The best you've ever had?" she said. "Accurate," Caleb said. "I'm not a ranch hand." "No," he said. "You're something else entirely." She stood on the porch in the April morning with the creek running somewhere below the ridge and the cattle making their unhurried sounds in the lower pasture, and she understood that she was no longer measuring. She had been measuring for months, consciously or not, assessing whether the terms were ones she could live with, whether the life was one that fit her, whether the man was what he presented as or something with a different shape underneath. She wasn't measuring anymore. The measuring had simply stopped, the way things stop when you've finally gotten enough information. The information was, this was real. Not perfect, never that, but honest and specific and built of actual things by actual people with actual faults. And it was hers, all the parts of it, the cold mornings and the difficult seasons and the town that had doubted her, and the man who hadn't, and the garden that needed more work every spring, and the bookshelves with the poetry in them, and the small wooden box on the fireplace shelf that she never moved from its place because it belonged there. Harlan's Crossing did not become a town that fully understood itself quickly. Towns don't. The people who had listened to Fitch continued, mostly, to be people who listened to whoever was speaking most confidently, which is the nature of small places, and possibly of larger ones too. But Garrett's water rights documentation got formalized, and Arden Cook started a town records committee that made it considerably harder to make certain kinds of land decisions without public notice, and the council that elected a new mayor in the spring found itself choosing a grain merchant named Holcomb, who was genuinely boring and genuinely honest, which turned out to be exactly what the territory needed. Clara became, without intending to and without a ceremony marking the transition, someone the town brought things to. Not for favors. She was particular about that, and said no clearly when no was the right answer, but for the specific kind of thinking she did, which was practical and unsentimentalized and didn't care whose feelings got complicated by the truth. Women came with land disputes and contract questions. Farmers came with water access concerns that now had proper channels. Dot Reeves wrote from Cheyenne twice a month, letters full of territorial land office observations that Clara found genuinely interesting and saved in a folder she kept in the kitchen drawer. Caleb watched all of this with a quietness that was not removed. He was in it, always. The morning conversations, the evening ones, the long discussions at the kitchen table when something needed thinking through, and he was the person she thought with. But he had the particular wisdom of a man who knows when to be present without being the center of it, which is rarer than it sounds and harder than it looks. She told him once, in November of that first married year, that she hadn't expected to find someone who knew how to do that. "Do what?" he said. "Be there without taking it over," she said. "Let things be mine without making it a thing." He thought about it. "Margaret used to say I was good at getting out of the way," he said. "She meant it as a criticism, I think. Or half of one." "She wasn't entirely wrong," Clara said. "You can take it too far. There are times you should say more." "I know," he said. "You tell me when." "I do," she said. "And you should also tell me. I take over things too." "I know I do." "You do," he said, without softness or apology, because she'd asked for honesty, and they'd established a long time ago that honesty was the currency they dealt in. "We're both difficult," she said. "We are," he said. "Good thing we're difficult together," she said. He didn't say anything to that. He just looked at her with the full attention she'd stopped being unnerved by and had started to understand was simply how he loved things, with his whole focus, without performance, steadily and for the long term. There are stories about frontier life that become simplified over time. The hardship is preserved because hardship makes good telling. The landscape is preserved because the landscape was genuinely extraordinary. But the interior lives of the people, the slow, private work of becoming who you were going to be, the accumulation of small daily decisions that added up to a life, those get smoothed out in the retelling until the people become symbols of something rather than people who were tired and stubborn and scared and occasionally wrong and keeping going anyway. Clara Voss Whitmore was not a symbol. She was a woman who had survived significant loss with her practical intelligence intact and her heart more guarded than she knew, who had gotten on a wagon with other women for reasons that had nothing to do with romance and ended up standing at the end of a line watching the weather, and had been seen clearly and specifically by a man who was also more guarded than he knew. She was not transformed by that. She was not rescued. She was recognized. And recognition, it turns out, is what most people are actually looking for when they think they're looking for love. Caleb Whitmore was not a symbol either. He was a man who had built 40 acres into a territory landmark and had done it, in significant part, to have something to give to someone, and had then spent 7 years finding no one to give it to. Not because there were no women, because there were no one who made him feel like the giving mattered. Clara made it matter, not by being extraordinary. She was simply herself, direct and capable, and inconvenient in the specific ways that genuine people are inconvenient, but by receiving what was given without performing gratitude, and without diminishing herself in the receiving, which is its own kind of gift. Years later, when the town had changed and grown, and the story had passed into the kind of local memory that gets told slightly differently each time, people remembered it mostly as the story of the unexpected choice. The man who walked past 9 women and picked the 10th. The woman who came for the transport and stayed for something else. But Clara, when people asked her about it, which they did, more than she expected, especially as she got older and the story acquired the patina of something worth asking about, gave the same answer every time. He saw me when I wasn't trying to be seen, she said, and what he saw was enough, not more than I was. Not less, just enough. She meant it the way she meant everything, precisely, without decoration, because the plain version of the true thing is always more durable than the dressed-up one. The creek ran every spring. The garden came back every year, better than the one before. The bookshelves acquired more volumes over time, some his, some hers, some purchased together at a bookseller in Cheyenne on the one trip they took to the city, which Caleb conceded was somewhat different from 1879. The wooden box stayed on the fireplace shelf, where it had always been, because some things deserve to stay where they belong. And in the mornings, which came early and cold and full of the sounds of a working place, Clara Whitmore was up before the light, the same as she'd always been, putting coffee on and looking out the east window at the ridge coming up out of the dark. Behind her, eventually, she would hear him in the hall, and then in the kitchen, and the day would begin the way days do when you've stopped dreading them. Without ceremony, without announcement, simply by arriving and finding you were ready.